Here we go. Wonderful to be here and see so many friends in the audience, and to have 25 minutes, so keep me to it, to lecture in part about Frank Horton, in part about the files, and in part about the fields. Frank Horton was truly a singular individual, shown here early on in his years at Old Salem, during the principal part of his career as the director at MESDA, and here at the end, what was really his first love, and that is as a researcher, and in the trenches researcher, who is literally, almost single-handedly, with a corps of soldiers helping him, change this field entirely. Leaders don't follow, but they often lead from the trenches, and they're rarely generals who didn't start out there. It's just rare that most of them are willing to stay there. This was a man of relatively few words. When he spoke, people listened. Instead, he was sitting, whoops, I can't move down this field like I thought. Yes, maybe I can. He spent 35 years, well, about half of his time. Can we move it up? Use two fingers. Got it. 35 years, about half of his time, at microfilm machines, setting the standard for another 24 individuals who helped to build the files at MESDA. That's the picture that's shown of him on the right. You don't see the one with a bandana around his head and a salve to take care of the headache from having read entirely too long, Yet Another Day. He did this 4.5 days a week in addition to his administrative capacities, and helped to change the world. I'd asked Gary for an image of the old Kroger supermarket as it was converted to MESDA, and he came up with this. It's an image I have never seen of the original MESDA before it was MESDA, and his field researchers who helped to start these files and begin the process back in the 70s that really have changed this world. There were endless discoveries, or the beginning of endless discoveries, that have resulted in some 200,000 cards about Southern artisans, and identified over 80,000 artisans that have completely changed our perception of the field. Their discoveries from the beginning were stupefying. Take, for example, these two pier tables, which you've already seen, and which were discovered relatively early in that field research program, both of them made by William Bernard Sears for Mount Airy in Richmond County, Virginia, and the Taylor family, sometime in the late 1750s or early 1760s. Frank Horton was always aware that what he was finding would have very little opportunity to come just to MESDA, and so he decided to collect pictures, which is what has changed the world. The one on the left, everybody here recognizes as one of the centerpieces, one of the great icons of not only MESDA's collection, but of the Southern world. And the one on the right went to Williamsburg, happily, and has played a similar role there. Over the years, those research files have been augmented by Tom and Ann Gray's great work and generosity in funding this expansive new library as of 2013, bringing the books together, the maps, the engravings, so that we have a much better idea of the cultural backgrounds of the things that help to shape these material expressions. You recognize Tom on the left and Anne on the right. It gives very little idea of the characters that these two human beings are. Anne should have a cigarette in that picture, probably a Winston. I met her pretty early in my career and used to come down to MESDA. do several days of research, and bring several boxes of smalls for her. So she'd say, come over, let's have a drink. So I'd go over and have a drink. She said, bring your things in, we'll have a look. Well, by this point, she had emphysema. She was still smoking, didn't seem to faze her, and also on oxygen. So she'd take a puff, she'd take a whiff of oxygen, and she'd talk. She says, what have you got in that box? And I'd line out 3 or 4 things. She said, take a puff, take a whiff. How much is it? I'd give her a price. She'd take a puff, take a whiff. I'll take it. What have you got over in that box? I said, this is X, that's Y, that's Z. She says, how much are they? I give her a price. She'd say, how much are all of them? I said, I'll give you a group price. She'd take a puff, she'd take a whiff. She said, I'll take them. Great lady. Tom is no less a character and no less naughty, as all of you know, and no less generous. And together they really have changed MESDA's public face and brought these great assets and great resources into the public eye. The Tom Gray Rare Book Room has focused on hard-to-find Southern imprints, hard-to-find cultural documents that are related to the history of the South, particularly those that in one way or another illustrate the history of the South, shape the thoughts and the outlooks and the attitudes of the craftsmen who made them and of the people who used them. Needless to say, the discoveries kept coming. MESDA finding things way out of context or sometimes right underneath our nose. Humbling in many respects for much larger institutions who were just surprised by the findings of this tiny little museum in North Carolina, who is doing from the trenches what all the great powers of the Northeast could never do and never accomplish on the same level. The great bucktrout Masonic chair, made in Williamsburg in the mid to late 1750s, late 1760s, and the Bird family tea table, both of which are now in the Colonial Williamsburg collection. And they're frank, of course, in storage at MESDA, showing but a few of many things in that collection. It's difficult to talk about the breadth or the size of the huge impact of MESDA's files. But there is nothing that goes on in this field, as Ron so clearly articulated, that MESDA's files do not, on a daily moment, impact both from their research, images, and the artisan cards that make it possible at times to track a single artisan as he moves across the southern landscape, from Norfolk to North Carolina to North Georgia. I'm going to look at Norfolk just briefly as a case study. 2 chairs here, which have ended up shown up in the left in a Virginia Beach museum, and one on the right at an auction in Pennsylvania. The one on the left is black walnut. The one on the right is black walnut. They have a finial and a slat and an arm that shows up on several North Carolina chairs in MESDA's files. The one on the left has a pretty solid history in Princess Anne County, Virginia. The one on the right is also walnut. Look at those strange arms, slightly canted, with a block turning, or with a block at the end. Those chairs push Southeast Virginia chairmaking back to about the 1790s, and you can track them all the way through to the mid-18th century. I actually handled the chair on the right, had it about 3 days between an auction and the Delaware show last year, and sold it on the floor to a Southern collector out of Mississippi. He called me about a week later with just about the worst news I'd heard in a long time. He said, "Sumpter, who is Robert Peter?" I said, "I don't know Robert Peter. Why do you ask?" He said there's an inscription on the back of this chair that says, chair owned by Robert Peter, emigrated county blank, 1706. Well, there's only one Robert Peter in America in 1720 or 1730 when that chair was made, and he lived in York County, Virginia. Surely enough, we have one documented to a specific owner. I think that this was probably included in an exhibition in Yorktown in 1876. I'm not sure yet, but we're in the midst of tracking it down. But we've got a whole slew of these things that we can now show reaching back to the late 17th century and changing one's perspective on what goes on in the South. The table in the lower right is one of 3 in MESDA's files with these very distinctive inverted trumpet with balusters above. With tiny, tight little vases actually turned above them. I looked for that feature on desk interiors for 25 years, and one showed up in a Pennsylvania shop. On the upper left, we now have a group that fits in tightly with undecorated interiors out of the Norfolk School. We have about 8 pieces from this shop. We don't yet know who it is. And in fact, it may be a turner from one shop and a cabinet maker from another, but helping to push Norfolk production back to certainly the 1720s and 30s, and perhaps somewhat further. We've got many avenues for exploring what goes on in the world of the South. And it's really to MESDA that we owe our increasing awareness of how layered and how complex and how mobile this world was, because we can now track individuals again as they move across the landscape. We've done a pretty good job of starting to isolate the regional schools, the city identities. But the question is, how now do we deal with interpreting and writing about the very complex world that takes place from the mid-18th century to the mid-19th, as the tidewater lands, particularly in Virginia and Maryland and the northern part of North Carolina, were depleted and huge numbers headed west. This all starts as early in Virginia as the 1730s for lots of different reasons. The tobacco having destroyed the land, tidewaters moving into the Piedmont, and English authorities are becoming increasingly concerned about the influence, heaven, of Presbyterians and Quakers. Increasingly strict laws about religion forced huge numbers of them out of southeast Virginia into northeast North Carolina, as the tobacco lands are starting to fail. Increasingly, as one looks at the artisans who are working in Norfolk and southeastern Virginia and northeastern North Carolina, one can track them as they move inland and then southward into Perquimans and adjoining counties. This desk by Willis Williams and his brother-in-law, John, what is his name? Right, thank you. Reflects the work of 2 artisans who were working in Southampton County between 1749 and 54. Both of them were born in Norfolk. Both of them were sons, grandsons, and great-grandsons of artisans who were born in Norfolk, the earliest having gotten off the boats in 1640 and 1650, respectively. They move into Southampton County because they're Quakers and join the other Quakers in that vicinity. The Sharrocks in the lower right, of Scots descent, move south out of Norfolk. This is just a hint of the things that have come together from Norfolk's work, from MESDA's work in southeastern Virginia, that's defining a completely new world of the colonial South that we simply, 20 years ago, would have never understood existed. This clock, which showed up in Georgia about a year ago, signed by Norfolk clockmaker John Jones, in a West Country Liverpool-type case. It is signed John Jones in Norfolk, Virginia. He was a native of Nansemond. It's possible to recognize this clock even without the signed signature. It is a standard Eastern Virginia production, except that it is the earliest by about 20 years of any of this style that we've yet identified. John Jones was born on the South Side, like many in Isle of Wight. He moves to Norfolk, trains there, works there between 1749 and 62, marries a young lady from Nansemond and moves to Nansemond. She's the daughter of the biggest builder in Nansemond. She dies in 1772. He moves back to Norfolk with an artisan by the name of William Jones. When Norfolk burns in 1775, John Jones dies, and William Jones moves to North Carolina. We're talking about larger, integrated economic units entwined because of the politics and the proximity and the families. John Jones and his wife's daughters marry into the family. It looks like they marry into the family of John Duke, one of the great benefactors of cabinet makers in North Carolina, and they move to North Carolina. Huge groups of things, such as these chairs, tables, they could well have been made in North Carolina. John Bivens and I used to love to argue about these things, but in fact, it's all about the turf wars that in fact the Scots are known so well for. And as Southerners today, we really need to look at the larger economic units and ignore these state lines to take us where research needs to take us. I'll show you that ball and claw foot at the top with this very distinctive knife blade edge, which I want you to note, because there's only one earlier piece than this chair, truly an icon of mid-century Southern production, that is not parallel to my way of thinking of anything in the Northeast except perhaps the finest of the Philadelphia Baroque furniture. But that shows up on this distinctive Scottish mercantile cabinet or scrutoire from the 1750s, likewise from the 1750s, almost certainly by the master of whoever it was that made most of the pieces in that group. There's a large group of Norfolk material that is tied to this group. The corner cupboard on the upper left is the earliest of formal Scottish corner cupboards that show up in Southeast Virginia. That pediment is identical to the one on this cupboard. On the right, you see it closed with those blind panels that we so often see on both sides of the line. Look at the foot on that cupboard to the left, the inturned foot, and those mullions. It's pretty surely from the same shop as this great cabinet. Again, a Scottish cabinet, this one with no clear history, but looking like it was used just across the river from Norfolk in Hampton, and dated 1773, with a distinctive pediment, the likes of which we haven't otherwise seen. But there are now two other pieces, large case pieces, from this same shop, redefining the parameters of how we think this world must have been, and completely redefining the rules of what the past must have been like. This corner cupboard that MESDA has been in the MESDA's collection for many years, and MESDA played the core role in identifying all of this early material. None of us who have worked in it get any credit were it not for the files that we've drawn on so heavily here. This is the earliest and the most fully developed of an inlay. The one on the right, that compass ornament was probably imported from one of the West Country ports. It ends up in much simpler form on this Pembroke table, actually labeled by Norfolk cabinet maker James Woodward, who was a youngster when the yellow fever epidemic ran through Norfolk in 1793 and killed literally every one of the colonial trained cabinet makers who were still alive, and left him in an ideal position to take over the trade in the city. He hired a fellow who signed his name on the back of that piece of paper, who was a sole joiner left from the late colonial period, who worked as a journeyman in his shop, and signed his name on the back as though he had made it. In fact, if you flip it over, it is signed and it is printed, James Woodward, cabinet maker, Norfolk. That opens up entirely new understanding and the breadth of things that we would have never seen 10 and 15 and 20 years ago. A pie wedge game table or card table with an overlaid satinwood fan. I've found none in the Northeast that have more than 8 segments. This one has 14, in addition to that quatrefoil or full-petal flower in the center, and what end up being here the most maturely developed bellflowers out there. Briefly looking at the backcountry, a great Frederick clock that MESDA documented, a Pokal by Carl Friedrich Amelung, the German who comes to Frederick County in the late 1780s and makes the finest glass anywhere in America from the 18th century. Truly miraculous material, and made for a member of the family, the Schley family, who owned this clock, who were the most sophisticated workmen in Frederick, and the grandson of the founder of the town. This man's brother ended up going to Georgia and becoming a governor there. There are other pieces vaguely related to examples from this group that appear in Georgia. The sofas, which had inlaid bellflowers, which we figured out only because MESDA documented a card table with a solid Winchester history. There are now 6 of these known, of the most amazing style, reflecting a form that is not made in England with those really deep sweeps and those OG-shaped arms, but rather Scots-Irish ones. Ones that are made in both Ireland and in Scotland in the 1780s and 1790s. On the right, a portrait by Charles Peel Polk showing a Winchester lady and her child seated in a sofa, unequivocally from the very same shop. Sideboards, unparalleled in the depth of their expression. Cellarettes or bottle cases. This one at Winter, long called Baltimore, which redefined the way style enters the backcountry. A pair of matching knife cases, which actually were in the Maryland files here at MESDA and remain in the family. Made for the Archibald Stewart House, completed in the 1790s, late 1780s and early 1790s in Stanton. And we can make some guesses about who's producing these based upon who is in Stanton at the time and some documents that survive in the family. And a watercolor drawing at the top for an addition at the back of the house by an artisan named Blackburn, who trained with Jefferson at who was actually a 3rd-generation builder from Spotsylvania County and moves to Charlottesville to work with Jefferson at the university and ends up as a director at Western State Hospital, where he was in charge of overseeing all the building out there. This is a complex world. Spice boxes, and dressing boxes, two of these now known from that same group. One could multiply these by a factor of 10 to understand the depth and the breadth of these worlds. For areas that 30 years ago, there was simply nothing known. A piece recently discovered from North Georgia, Walton County, the 1820s or 30s, totally distinct from anything that's been seen further north. It's not a German dower chest, but a Scots-Irish dower chest. We don't know who owned this, but another one from the same shop was made for a young lady whose mother's family were German, and her grandfather had come straight from Germany to Orange County, Virginia, to work for Governor Spotswood in the 18th century as a youngster. And the other side of the family were Scots-Irish. If you look at the beaks down below, it's a combination of the Scots-Irish chest made along the Rappahannock and the German dower chests that her grandfather probably owned and grandmother owned in the late 18th century. The iconography, we're only beginning to understand the subtleties of iconography of these things, and I'm going to be done here in just 3 minutes. This chest has paired trees of life on the front, but it's not until you see all three sides that you understand the levels of the complexity. The left end has two trees with the leaf buds of spring. The front shows them with two fully leaved trees at the height of the summer season, and on the right with the last vestiges of fall. It's a perfect iconography for a young lady contemplating marriage and the seriousness of a lifelong commitment. It also has passion flowers representing Christ and those odd, seemingly odd carrots and triangles. Those are Masonic emblems for plums. On the square, carpenter's plums. And when you look at these features of passion flowers as representing the Lord, Christ the carpenter, Christ the vine, in fact, here you have religious symbolism about righteousness, all laid over in the seemingly very simple dower chest from the 1820s or 30s out of North Georgia. There's an incredible example in the Georgia Museum from which I first learned of this group that descended in the family, signed for Mary Chronic and dated 1839. Probably not the same cabinet maker, but there's lots of poetry and religious symbolism published on trees of life and Scots-Irish iconography that shows how layered and deep these icons run. Here you see them on a corner cupboard. You see the one on the left from the front of the chest, and then paired trees of life on the right from a tombstone, which is clearly not about marriage. One's about the tree of temptation in the Garden of Eden, and the other is Christ as a tree of virtue. And the two choices, and there are great sermons about this by the fathers of Presbyterianism that were recited in churches throughout the region, shows up in hymns and in poetry. The man who carved the tombstone on the right in 1791 also carved a tombstone with poems about trees of life that very same year. And thankfully, it's the MESDA, and I'll end up with this image. Oh, I have one more. All right, you got me. The chest on the lower right. As we're figuring all of these things out, I was at MESDA. It brought these pictures down. One of the last weekends I was here, Dale was here. Keith McCurry was out of South Carolina, was here, and he was looking at through the Alabama files, and he found the chest on the lower right, which looks quite different, but in fact is from the same cabinet-making shop and probably the same painter. The moldings are identical, though probably 10 or 15 years apart. It's known who owned it. And going through my files, I stumbled across portraits of the original owners that somebody else out of Alabama had sent me. The question is now, did this, this is something that's just come together in the last week. Did the owner of that chest move from Georgia to Alabama? He's buried in Alabama. Or did the maker move to Alabama, which would be a logical move? And do we, in fact, once again, to understand Southern culture, have to move across the Southern landscape for this very mobile and very complex world? Lastly, in looking at the amazing things that have come together as a result of MESDA's files, an increased awareness of the English, the Scots-Irish, the Germans, the Moravians, the complexities and the layers of this culture, but also heights that we never realized or never allowed ourselves to realize existed. The economics of the 19th century were very, very hard on us. There were very few institutions to do the work, very few universities, comparatively speaking, to pursue it. But more importantly, it's the cultural nature of the South, its mobility, the Western movement, the depletion of the coastal lands that make this culture so much more evasive and so much more difficult to pin down. Much of the South's shortcomings, I think, or perceived shortcomings, have been the fact that in the past we've had so little to aspire to because we understood so little about the depth or the breadth or the meaning of this culture. At the end of the day, it is MESDA that is laying the groundwork to make it possible for us to have greater aspirations, to understand how incredibly complex this world was in which our ancestors lived, and in fact, to help us stand up aesthetically and culturally in a way that compares equally complex with what's going on in the North, just a very different world. Thank you, MESDA. I appreciate everyone being here to celebrate this great institution's 50th anniversary.